Welcome everybody to this tutorial video. My name is Scott McMillan. I'm the project lead for the IHSS Benchmark Dashboard. In this video, I'm going to show you how to reformat your incident data in Excel using Power Query. And this is going to allow you to reformat your data if it's in a specific format whereby your multiple categories are contained in a single cell and a single row. But before we take a closer look at that, let's first refresh on what it should look like and the format that is required for the benchmark dashboard so we understand where we need to get to. What you're seeing here is a sample of data that's laid out in the proper format. It's got columns and rows. The key thing to point out here is that the benchmark dashboard requires each category to be a single row. So again, if your reporting system allows you to capture multiple categories per single report, those need to be separated into their own row because it allows us to do counts on those and in turn create benchmarks on all of the individual categories. It'd be very difficult to do that if they're all combined into a single cell. And to emphasize that, if we look at the two rows that are highlighted in red, we can see that they share the same report number. So that indicates that this particular report has two categories. It happens to have an aggression category and it has a patient restraint category attached to it. This is where we need to get to. So with that in mind, let's take a look at how to reformat data that's not quite in this format. This particular data set may look like yours if your reporting system, as I mentioned, allows you to capture multiple categories, but the output combines them in a single row, puts all the categories in a single cell, and within a single column. So again, if we look on the left-hand side of the report number, if we go down the list, we'll see that there's no number repeated. That's because it's in a single row. So what we need to do is we need to separate these into their own columns, and then we need to separate those into their own rows. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and we're going to do it using Power Query, which is only available in more recent versions of Excel. If you're watching this video and your Excel does not have Power Query, no problem. There is another way to do it using a format called text to columns, which is available in a different video. All right, so let's continue on here. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to highlight all of our data. There's a couple ways you can do it. You can highlight all of the columns. You can click on this little box on the left here above row 1 and beside column A, which will highlight all of the worksheet. I prefer to only highlight what actually contains data. So I'm going to click on this first cell, hold the Shift and Control button, and I'm going to push on the right directional arrow on my keypad. That's going to highlight only the columns that actually have something in this first row. I'm going to continue to hold Shift and Control and push on the down arrow. That's now going to highlight only the rows that actually contain data in at least one of the columns. This way, I'm not including the columns and rows that are blank and don't have any information. But either way, you highlight your data. Then at the top on your ribbon bar here, we're going to click on the one that says Data. On the left side here is an option called From Table/Range. We're going to go ahead and click on that. It's going to bring up a little box that basically just wants us to confirm the data range that we want to work with, which is highlighted exactly what we have. The other thing you want to make sure is that you have this checkbox checked off. That's to indicate that your columns have headers to them, which we're going to need when we start to use the Power Query tool. So with that checked off, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. That's going to now open up a new page, and actually on the top left here, you'll note that it's telling us that we are now in the Power Query Editor page. And it has a copy of our data. And I say copy because our original data is still in behind. We're not making any changes yet to the actual data. We're going to do some steps and perform some functions in here. And once we're happy, then we will actually launch it, which is then going to change the original data. So the first thing we need to do is we need to highlight the column containing the categories because this is the column that we need to deal with. This is the one that we need to separate. We see in this first row here that we've got two categories, intrusion alarm, break and enter. So we want to be able to separate these. So we're going to click on it. We're going to right click on the top header row And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go down about midway where there's an option called split column. That's going to open up some further options on the right. The one that we want to use is this one here, which is called by delimiter. And we're going to go ahead and click on that. Now, it's going to want us to identify, well, what is the character or symbol within the cell that indicates a point at which you want me to separate this? If I just highlight the top row here, you'll notice between intrusion alarm and break and enter, there's a comma. That's the symbol that this particular data set uses to separate the categories. So knowing that, that's the one that we're going to want to identify for our purposes. So I'm going to click the arrow because it defaults to space. Ours does not use a space, so we're going to click here. And we're going to see if comma is an option, which it is. It's the second one from the top, which is great. Now, if your reporting system uses a different symbol, maybe it uses a hyphen or a period or a colon or a semicolon, whatever it might be, if it's not one of these options, you can click custom and you can type in the actual character or symbol that your system uses. But we're going to go ahead and click comma because we know that this data set uses a comma to separate the categories. And we're going to click OK. What that's now done is it's taken that single column that had all of our categories and it's now separated into additional columns. So we now have category 1 column, category 2, and category 3. So the fact that there's only 3 columns tells me that in this entire data set, there's at least one report that contains 3 categories. No more, because if there was more, then there would be additional columns. Power Query is very intelligent. It only creates the columns that are absolutely necessary based on what's in your actual data. So now that we've separated, we're off to a great start, but we still need to get these into their own row. They are still, unfortunately, still attached to the same row, which is going to make it difficult to count in the benchmark dashboard. But before we do that, there's one little thing we need to do to clean up this data, which is to remove the space in front of the categories listed in column 2 and 3. Because grammatically, after a comma, there's always a space before the next character. That space still remains in these 2 columns, and Excel treats that as if it was a number or a letter, which could cause us problems when we're mapping in down the road. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. So to do that, we're going to highlight all of these. Technically, we don't really need to include this column, but it doesn't hurt to do it anyways. We might as well trim all of them. And trim is exactly the term for the function that we're going to use. So once again, on the top header row, we're going to right-click, and we are going to go about halfway down where it says transform. On the right-hand side, there's options, and about midway down is trim. We're going to go ahead and trim that. And you might have actually noticed that these shifted to the left by one character, which was that extra space. So now that we've removed that, our data is clean, it's good. Now we need to perform the next critical step, which is we now need to separate these into their own row. So with them highlighted already, we're going to go ahead and right-click again anywhere on the top. And we're now going to perform a function called unpivot. So if you go to the bottom, you'll notice that there's actually 3 unpivot options. The one that we're going to select is the last one, which is called unpivot only the selected columns. We're going to click that. And what that has done is it's now done 2 things. First is it's combined those 3 columns into one. But unlike the original data that was in one column, these now contain only a single category. It's now created a new row for all of those other categories. And not only that, but it's automatically added all of the other information from these other columns into those new rows, which is fantastic because we want that information. The other thing that it's done is it's added a new column called attribute, which is now telling you kind of how the original data was laid out. It's telling you that this one was in category 1, this was in category 2. If it has 3 categories, it's telling you that it was in category 1, 2, 3. We are going to need to remove this. And we're going to need to remove it because the next step is we want to remove any duplicate reports. If an author has accidentally added the same category twice into a report, now that those categories are their own row, we don't want to be counting both of those because it's actually double counting, which is going to skew the data. So we're going to need to remove the duplicates. The problem is that this column is actually assigning a unique designation to these, which is going to make it hard for us to identify which ones are duplicates. So we're going to just simply remove this. We're going to right click and we're going to click on remove. We don't need it. With that gone, the last step is to remove the duplicates. And you'll actually notice there's an example of this here. In row 3 and 4, both of these say escort patient. If I scroll to the left, we'll actually notice that they share the same report number. So that's an example of where, in this particular report, this author has accidentally added the same category to this report twice. So this is an example of why we need to remove these duplicates. So we're going to highlight all of the columns because we want to remove it from all of the data. That's that one. And that's it. And again, on the top, we're going to right click. And about a third of the way down is this option called Remove Duplicates. So we're going to click on that, and we should actually notice one of those escort patients in either row 3 or 4 should disappear. And I don't know if you saw it, but that's exactly what happened. We've now got only one escort patient, which is attached to report number 2. That is the last step that's required. And I mentioned steps because if you notice on the right-hand side here under Power Query, it actually tells you the steps that we performed individually and in order. That's kind of handy because if you do make a mistake somewhere along the way, you don't have to restart and start all over again. You can simply remove the step that you didn't need to include by clicking the little X here and removing it. But if you were able to follow along with me, there should be no need to remove any steps. And your data has now been reformatted into the proper format. So the last thing we need to do is actually run these steps against the original data. To do that, on the left here, we're going to hit close and load. And what it's done is it's now actually created a new worksheet or a new tab containing our new data. So we don't lose the old data. It's still here. You'll also notice on the right-hand side here that it's telling us that there's 374 rows of data in this data set. If I close that, if we go back to the original data, I'll just highlight one column. If you look on the bottom here, it's telling us that this original data had 369 rows of data. So that's evidence that it worked because we should expect to have more rows in our new data now that we've separated the categories into their own rows. Now, in this particular sample data, it didn't significantly change. It went from 369 to 374. But in your data set, you might notice that it's a significant change. Either way, we know that it's worked. It's now evidence that it's worked. And again, one last check is if we scroll down our report, we should start to see report numbers being repeated. As we do here, as we do here. This one here has 3 categories, and they should not be the same. There should not be any duplicates. We'll actually highlight those rows and scroll to the right. We should see 3 completely different categories, which is exactly what we have. So this worked. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is now the data set that you can save. This is the file that you will now upload into the benchmark dashboard and start the process. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this helped. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to the IHSS or myself, and good luck.